January 1945. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. The war in Europe is entering its final phase, but inside Eisenhower's command tent, the crisis is not German resistance. It is American pride. Dwight Eisenhower sits at his desk with two documents in front of him. One is a draft order relieving Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery of command. The other is a casualty summary from the Hürtgen Forest. One document threatens a political explosion inside the alliance. The other records tens of thousands of American dead. The decision has already been made. Montgomery's offense is not military failure. It is a 60-minute press conference delivered days earlier in Belgium, where he publicly implied that American armies had collapsed in the Ardennes and required British leadership to be saved. Eisenhower knows exactly what those words mean. If Montgomery is not checked, Bradley and other senior American commanders will resign. The alliance could fracture in the middle of a war. At the same time, General Omar Bradley remains in full command. His armies have just concluded 5 months of fighting in the Hürtgen Forest. 33,000 American casualties. Entire divisions shattered for terrain that held no decisive value. No breakthrough. No strategic gain. No inquiry. Eisenhower does not summon Bradley for explanation. He does not order an investigation. He does not draft a relief order. Instead, he separates the two cases completely. One general will be punished for words. The other will be protected from numbers. The decision is not debated. It is not documented as a moral choice. It is framed as necessity. Montgomery is a political liability. Bradley is not. Within weeks, the draft order against Montgomery is quietly shelved. Bradley is promoted. The casualty lists are filed away as the unavoidable cost of difficult terrain. The meeting ends without ceremony. No speech. No record. From this moment forward, the outcome is locked in. By September 1944, the American armies in Western Europe possessed an advantage rarely seen in modern war. German forces west of the Rhine were disorganized, understrength, and short of fuel. The U.S. Army enjoyed overwhelming superiority in artillery, armor, air power, and logistics. Operational maneuver was not only possible. It was expected. The Hürtgen Forest did not block this advantage. It sat to the south of Aachen, a dense expanse of steep hills, pine forest, narrow trails, and prepared German defenses. It was not a gateway to Germany's industrial heartland. It did not guard a major city. It did not offer terrain from which the Germans could launch a decisive counteroffensive. It was a flank obstacle. Military logic offered multiple options. The forest could be masked and bypassed. German units inside could be isolated, cut off from supply, and rendered irrelevant without direct engagement. This approach aligned with American doctrine, which emphasized mobility, combined arms, and the avoidance of frontal assaults against prepared positions. It preserved manpower. It maintained momentum. Bradley was presented with these options. His staff discussed them. George Patton argued for them openly. The map made the case unmistakable. To the south, open ground allowed maneuver. To the north, Allied forces were already pushing toward the Ruhr River. The forest was not a gate. It was a trap. Even the stated justification for the assault did not require a frontal attack. Bradley argued that German control of the Ruhr River dams posed a flooding risk. If the Germans destroyed or opened them, advancing Allied forces could be delayed. But control of the dams did not require clearing the forest first. The dams lay beyond it. They could be seized through maneuver, airborne operations, or a rapid thrust around the forest perimeter. What was militarily possible, therefore, was restraint. Time favored the Allies. German forces were retreating everywhere else. There was no operational necessity to grind forward through terrain that neutralized American strengths. Armor could not maneuver. Artillery observation was restricted. Air support was largely blind. Infantry advanced along predictable paths into pre-registered fire. Every principle of economy of force argued against the decision that followed. The opportunity was not a dramatic breakthrough or a bold encirclement. It was something simpler and more valuable. It was the opportunity to conserve combat power for battles that mattered, to keep divisions intact for the coming push into the German heartland. to avoid a battle that offered no decisive payoff. The U.S. Army could afford patience. It could afford maneuver. It could afford to let the forest sit, contained and irrelevant. What it could not afford, from a purely military perspective, was a prolonged attritional fight that consumed entire divisions for marginal ground. That outcome was not imposed by the enemy. It was chosen. At that moment, the opportunity was not victory through sacrifice. It was victory through omission. The warnings did not come from hindsight. They existed before the first rifle company entered the trees. George Patton studied the same maps as Bradley. He required no reconnaissance flights or intelligence estimates to reach his conclusion. The terrain itself was the warning. Dense forest, limited roads, elevated ground favoring the defender. A battlefield where speed, armor, and air power would be neutralized by default. Patton's assessment was blunt and consistent. The Hürtgen Forest was not an objective. It was an obstacle. His recommendation never changed. Bypass it. Contain it. Let German units inside remain pinned and irrelevant while American forces advanced elsewhere. This was not recklessness. It was economy of force. Bradley's own staff raised similar concerns. Operational planners outlined alternatives that preserved momentum without committing divisions to a fight that offered no decisive return. The German army, they argued, was already collapsing under pressure across the front. There was no requirement to destroy every pocket immediately. Time was not the enemy. The warnings were reinforced once the fighting began. Early engagements confirmed every pre-war concern. Infantry units reported invisible enemy positions, artillery bursting in treetops, and complete loss of coordination between arms. Progress was measured in yards. Casualties mounted immediately. Division commanders requested pauses. They asked for revised objectives. They reported that terrain, not German maneuver, was inflicting the majority of losses. These were not emotional protests. They were professional assessments from officers watching their units degrade without progress. Bradley acknowledged the reports. He read them. He did not dispute the facts, but he rejected the conclusions. His belief in the necessity of taking the forest hardened rather than weakened. Each setback became proof that more force was required, not that the premise was flawed. Fresh divisions were committed to achieve what exhausted divisions could not. The warnings became background noise. Patton's objections grew sharper. He warned that infantry consumed in the forest would not be available elsewhere. He warned that attrition would leave the army brittle when the Germans counterattacked. These warnings were not speculative. They were grounded in operational math. Bradley dismissed them as impatience. He viewed Patton's proposals as irresponsible maneuver that ignored the flooding risk of the Ruhr dams. The debate ended there. No further consideration was given. By the time entire divisions were rotated out of the forest shattered and combat ineffective, the warning phase was over. The predictions had been validated in blood. Yet the operation continued. What mattered was not whether the warnings were accurate. They were. What mattered was that accepting them required admitting the original decision was wrong. That admission never came. The overrule did not arrive as a single order. It emerged through silence, deference, and institutional convenience. By late 1944, the scale of loss in the Hürtgen Forest was undeniable. Casualty reports stacked up week after week. Divisions entered the forest intact and emerged hollowed out. Yet no command conference was called to reassess the premise of the operation. No external review was initiated. The machinery of command absorbed the losses and continued forward. This was not ignorance. Eisenhower was fully informed. As Supreme Allied Commander, he received regular summaries from Bradley's headquarters. He knew the casualty figures. He understood the lack of progress. He had approved bypass operations elsewhere under similar conditions. The difference at Hürtgen was not military. It was political. Bradley occupied a unique position inside Eisenhower's command structure. He was not merely a subordinate. He was a trusted American counterpart whose presence stabilized the alliance. Eisenhower needed a senior U.S. Army Group commander who would not challenge strategic direction, provoke public controversy, or compete for political influence. Bradley filled that role perfectly. Removing him carried consequences Eisenhower was unwilling to face. Firing Bradley would require explaining why an American general had been allowed to consume multiple divisions without decisive gain. It would invite congressional scrutiny. It would elevate alternatives Eisenhower did not want. The most obvious alternative was Patton. Militarily aggressive, politically volatile, impossible to control. Eisenhower understood that replacing Bradley with Patton would exchange quiet attrition for unpredictable headlines. That trade was unacceptable. At the same time, Eisenhower was managing a parallel crisis with Montgomery. The British Field Marshal was publicly challenging American leadership and demanding greater authority. Eisenhower needed Bradley as a counterweight. A compliant American general with unquestioned loyalty was essential to balancing British influence without escalating alliance tensions. This context shaped every decision that followed. Bradley's failures were reframed as environmental difficulties rather than command errors. The forest became the villain. The weather, the terrain, German defensive preparation. Each explanation diluted personal responsibility. The institutional response followed predictable patterns. Units were rotated rather than objectives reconsidered. Fresh divisions were committed to maintain pressure rather than to achieve breakthrough. Losses were normalized as the unavoidable cost of fighting in difficult conditions. At no point did Eisenhower publicly associate Bradley's name with the outcome. There were no reprimands, no critical memoranda, no private warning that his command was in jeopardy. Silence became endorsement. This restraint contrasted sharply with Eisenhower's reaction to Montgomery's behavior. When Montgomery spoke out of turn, Eisenhower drafted relief orders within hours. Not because Montgomery had failed militarily at that moment, but because his actions threatened alliance cohesion and American prestige. The message inside headquarters was clear. Battlefield losses could be absorbed. Political disruption could not. Bradley understood this environment instinctively. He did not protest. He did not argue publicly. He did not deflect blame upward. He accepted responsibility in private language that framed the losses as necessary and unavoidable. This posture reinforced Eisenhower's confidence that Bradley would not become a problem. The overrule, therefore, was passive. It consisted of allowing the operation to continue unchecked while insulating the commander from consequence. Military logic was subordinated not by direct order, but by institutional preference. By the time the Battle of the Bulge erupted, the consequences of this choice were already embedded. Divisions that might have served as reserves had been consumed in the forest. Units pulled from Hürtgen were sent to quiet sectors to rebuild. One of those sectors was the Ardennes. When German forces struck, Eisenhower reacted decisively. But the conditions that made the initial breakthrough possible had been created earlier, quietly, through a refusal to challenge a trusted subordinate. The overrule was not dramatic. It was administrative. It left no paper trail accusing anyone of error. It preserved harmony inside the command structure. It also locked in the cost. The consequences unfolded slowly, then all at once. In the Hürtgen Forest, the fighting did not climax. It degraded. Week by week, American units were fed into the same terrain, against the same defenses, with the same results. Progress was measured in tree lines and ravines that could not be held without paying for them again the next day. The forest absorbed men without producing momentum. Casualties accumulated in a way that was administratively manageable but operationally corrosive. Divisions were not destroyed in dramatic encirclements. They were worn down through constant exposure to artillery, mines, and small unit engagements that offered no relief. Replacement troops arrived faster than lessons were learned. The system kept functioning, which allowed the decision to persist. By November 1944, the 28th Infantry Division entered the forest already under strength. It left it shattered. Over 6,000 casualties in less than a week. Entire battalions ceased to exist as coherent units. The division was no longer combat effective, yet it had achieved no strategic objective proportional to the loss. The forest remained contested. The Ruhr dams remained untouched. This pattern repeated across multiple divisions. The 9th Infantry Division, the 4th Infantry Division, Each absorbed losses that should have triggered reassessment. Instead, they were rotated, rebuilt on paper, and reassigned. The cost was not concentrated enough to force a single reckoning. It was distributed. By December, the cumulative total approached 33,000 American casualties. That figure did not produce alarm inside headquarters. It was processed as an aggregate of separate engagements rather than as evidence of a failed concept. No single day rivaled the losses of a major set-piece battle. There was no visual moment of catastrophe. The forest concealed the scale of destruction as effectively as it concealed the enemy. The strategic cost extended beyond the forest itself. Divisions consumed there could not be used elsewhere. Units that might have served as mobile reserves were fixed in terrain that rewarded the defender and punished the attacker. Bradley's army group entered the winter campaign with diminished flexibility. When the German counteroffensive erupted in the Ardennes in mid-December, this depletion became visible. The sector struck by the Germans was considered quiet precisely because American units there were exhausted. The 28th Infantry Division, withdrawn from Hürtgen to rebuild, was assigned to hold a long, thin front. Its weakness was not accidental. It was the direct result of earlier decisions. When German forces attacked, they achieved surprise and depth not because American soldiers lacked courage, but because American formations lacked resilience. Units that should have absorbed the initial shock instead fractured. The line bent sharply. Crisis replaced attrition. Eisenhower responded decisively to the emergency. Command arrangements were altered. Reserves were rushed forward. Patton's army pivoted north. The German advance was eventually halted and reversed. In the official narrative, the Battle of the Bulge became a story of recovery and ultimate victory. The Hürtgen Forest did not appear in that narrative as a causal factor. Its role was implicit, not acknowledged. Yet the connection was direct. The forest had consumed the margin of error. After the Bulge, the offensive resumed. The Ruhr dams were finally seized in February 1945, not through the forest, but through operations that bypassed it. The flooding Bradley had feared occurred anyway. It delayed the Allied advance briefly, then subsided. The outcome validated the warnings that had been ignored months earlier. By then, the forest had been rendered irrelevant by events elsewhere. Its defenders withdrew or surrendered as Allied forces crossed the Rhine on a broad front. The ground that had cost so much blood was abandoned without ceremony. The institutional response to these outcomes was silence. No after-action review at the highest level questioned the necessity of the battle. Official histories described the fighting as difficult but unavoidable. Terrain and weather were emphasized. Command decisions were not. Bradley emerged from the campaign without formal criticism. His reputation as a steady, reliable commander remained intact. The casualties were attributed to the nature of warfare in Germany, not to the choice of where and how to fight. Montgomery's situation unfolded differently. His failure at Market Garden, which had cost fewer casualties over a shorter period, remained a subject of tension. His later press conference nearly ended his career. Words threatened the alliance more than losses. The contrast was stark. One commander presided over a prolonged attritional failure and advanced. The other spoke imprudently and nearly fell. For the soldiers who fought in the Hürtgen Forest, the consequences were final. Units returned from the forest changed. Veterans spoke of it as worse than Normandy. The enemy was less visible. The environment more hostile. Survival felt arbitrary. Morale suffered in ways not captured by statistics. For families, the cost arrived in telegrams that offered no explanation beyond duty and sacrifice. The purpose of the battle was not clarified because it had never been clarified inside headquarters. There was no decisive victory to point to. No city liberated. No line broken. The forest remained a footnote in the larger campaign. Its losses were absorbed into the totality of the war, where numbers are easier to accept when detached from cause. The consequences, therefore, were not confined to casualties. They included precedent, a command culture in which loyalty insulated decision-makers from accountability, a system where errors that did not disrupt political balance were tolerated. By the end of the war, the cost of Hürtgen had been paid in full. What remained was its absence from judgment. After the war, the record settled into place quietly. No tribunal examined the Hürtgen Forest. No congressional inquiry demanded explanations. The campaign passed into official history as a difficult but necessary operation on the road to Germany. Language softened. Responsibility diffused. Bradley's post-war career advanced without interruption. He was promoted to 5-star rank. He became the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His reputation solidified as the calm, reasonable American commander who balanced stronger personalities and held the alliance together. In memoirs and interviews, Hürtgen received brief treatment. The terrain was blamed. The enemy's preparations were emphasized. The battle was described as costly, but inevitable. What never appeared was a sustained defense of the decision to fight there at all. Eisenhower's memoirs followed the same pattern. He acknowledged the difficulty of the forest and the heavy losses. He did not question the strategic premise. The emphasis remained on unity, cooperation, and the burdens of coalition command. In Eisenhower's telling, the greatest dangers of the war were political fractures, not operational errors. This framing mattered. It established what would be remembered and what would not. Market Garden became synonymous with overreach. Montgomery's name remained attached to failure despite its brevity and limited scope. Hürtgen dissolved into statistics. Declassified documents reinforced the pattern rather than challenged it. Situation reports, casualty summaries, and operational directives showed that Eisenhower was aware of the losses as they occurred. They showed that alternatives were discussed. They did not show decisive intervention. The absence was the point. Bradley's own writings reflected a careful tone. He accepted that the forest had been costly. He maintained that the risk to the Roer dams justified the operation. He did not revisit whether bypassing the forest might have achieved the same objective at lower cost. The question was closed by assertion, not analysis. Military historians who later examined the campaign reached different conclusions. Many identified Hürtgen as one of the most unnecessary battles fought by American forces in Europe. They noted that the Roer dams were seized later through maneuver. They highlighted the mismatch between cost and outcome. But these assessments arrived long after careers had been made and narratives fixed. The institutional memory of the U.S. Army absorbed Hürtgen as an anomaly rather than a warning. It was studied tactically: tree bursts, restricted terrain, infantry-artillery coordination. The operational decision that put divisions there in the first place received less attention. The contrast with Montgomery's experience remained striking. His press conference continued to be cited as an example of how personal behavior could endanger coalition warfare. Eisenhower's near decision to fire him was praised as restraint in the face of provocation. The fact that Bradley's battlefield decisions produced greater losses without consequence rarely entered the same discussion. By the time official histories were published, the war had acquired its heroes and its acceptable failures. Hürtgen did not fit cleanly into either category. It lacked drama. It lacked redemption. It offered no decisive turning point. As a result, it was allowed to fade. What survived were promotions, reputations, and a command culture that validated discretion over accountability. The post-war record did not lie. It selected. The files closed without verdict. The promotion stood. The forest remained where it had always been. The case closes without ambiguity. The decision that mattered was never made on a battlefield. It was made in a headquarters where political stability outweighed operational correction. Eisenhower chose to protect a loyal subordinate rather than expose a flawed command decision. The cost of that choice was absorbed by infantry divisions whose names faded faster than the casualty totals. Bradley was not promoted because Hürtgen succeeded. It did not. He was promoted because he never threatened the structure Eisenhower was responsible for preserving. He did not challenge authority. He did not provoke allies. He did not create political risk. In a coalition war, those traits proved more valuable than battlefield outcomes. Montgomery's near dismissal confirmed the rule. Military failure could be tolerated. Political disruption could not. One general lost 17,000 men and remained dangerous because he spoke publicly. Another lost nearly twice that number and advanced because he stayed silent. The institutional verdict was rendered through action, not words. No inquiry. No reprimand. No pause. Promotions followed continuity, not correction. The system protected itself. The Hürtgen Forest remains the evidence, not as a dramatic defeat, but as a prolonged expenditure of lives that produced nothing commensurate with the cost. Its absence from post-war reckoning is not accidental. It is the final outcome of the decision made months earlier. This was not incompetence misunderstood. It was competence constrained by politics. The machinery worked as designed. The file is closed. If you want more investigations into the decisions that shaped the war long before the shooting started, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment if you think this case was judged correctly.